What was a typical day like for a factory worker in the Victorian era? Not at all what you might imagine. Right now, you will learn all the details and peculiarities of the daily routine of a factory worker. We will immerse ourselves in a world where the day began before dawn and ended late at night, and the only measure of life was the factory siren. We will see two societies existing side by side, but separated by an insurmountable gap between wealth and poverty. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn how, in such conditions, people not only survived, but also found the strength to fight for their rights, laying the foundations of modern society. The industrial cities of the Victorian era, whether Manchester or Liverpool, woke up not to the singing of birds, but to a heavy cough. Huge factory chimneys belched thick black smoke into the sky, which mixed with the morning fog to create a dense, grayish-yellow smog. This smog permeated everything: clothes, house walls, residents' lungs, and was a constant companion in their lives. The air had its own special smell, a mixture of coal, machine oil, and dampness emanating from the overpopulated residential areas. For a worker leaving his home at 5 in the morning, this smell was as familiar as the feeling of constant fatigue. He walked through streets where sunlight struggled to penetrate the veil of smoke, and houses looked like gray shadows. The city's soundscape was a continuous hum consisting of thousands of different noises. The distant clanging of hammers from the docks, the creaking of carts on cobblestones, the cries of street vendors, and, of course, the incessant roar of factories. This noise was the soundtrack of industrialization, which never stopped, day or night. An aristocrat or wealthy industrialist, this urban landscape was merely a backdrop, a symbol of power and progress. They drove through the cleaner central streets in their carriages, heading to their country estates or respectable clubs. Their world was protected from the dirt and noise by thick walls and high social status. The worker, on the other hand, was completely immersed in this environment. His way to the factory lay through a maze of narrow, dirty streets where slops were thrown from the windows of houses directly onto the pavement. There was no greenery here, only stone, brick, and coal dust underfoot. The contrast was striking and evident in everything. While servants in London's West End polished silver for breakfast, workers in the East End bought stale bread from street vendors. These two worlds existed in the same city, but according to completely different laws of physics and time. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. Do you think such progress can be called a blessing for everyone if it created such different living conditions? Write about it in the comments. For the working class, the city was not just a place to live, but a giant mechanism of which they were a part. Their homes were merely barracks for sleeping, and the streets were roads leading to their workplace. Their entire existence was subordinated to the rhythm of the factory. When a worker approached the gates of his factory, he saw before him a huge brick building, more like a fortress or a prison. Steam poured out of its windows, and the hum of the machines was almost deafening. This was his world for the next 12 or even 14 hours. At the same time, somewhere on his estate, a representative of the gentry, a landowner without a title, could be preparing for the morning hunt. He was surrounded by spacious fields, clean air, and silence, broken only by the barking of dogs. He was a symbol of Old England, which was rapidly disappearing under the onslaught of industrialization. The working day began not with sunrise, but with the piercing wail of the factory siren. This sound carried over the roofs of the working-class neighborhoods long before dawn, tearing people from their short and restless sleep. They had no alarm clocks. The siren was their common, inexorable master of time. Families woke up in cramped, damp rooms, where several people often huddled together in a single space. Breakfast was meager and quick: a piece of bread, perhaps a little oatmeal, and a mug of weak tea. Every minute counted, because being late to the factory was punishable by a fine that hurt their already meager budget. Thousands of people poured out onto the dark streets and merged into a single stream flowing toward the factory gates. It was a silent, sleepy procession with everyone lost in their thoughts about the day ahead. There was little conversation, only the shuffling of hundreds of feet on the dirty cobblestones. That same morning, life was completely different in an aristocratic mansion. The head of the family woke up in a spacious bedroom with high ceilings when sunlight was already flooding the room. He had a leisurely morning toilet, which took at least an hour and required the help of several servants. The aristocrat's breakfast was a whole ritual. On a table covered with a snow-white tablecloth stood dishes with ham, eggs, fresh pastries, jams, and hot chocolate. The morning newspapers, fresh and ironed, lay nearby, waiting for the master of the house to catch up on the latest political news. While the worker crossed the factory gate, where the overseer strictly monitored the time, the aristocrat could plan his day. Perhaps it would be a visit to Parliament, a meeting at the club, a horse ride, or preparations for the evening ball. His time belonged to him, and it was filled with leisure and social obligations. For the worker, however, time was a commodity that he sold for pennies. His day was scheduled not by the hour but by the minute, and each minute was controlled by the factory administration. He did not own his time, he was its slave. The lower middle class, clerks and small traders, were somewhere in the middle. Their day also began early, but they did not go to a noisy workshop, but to a quiet office or shop. Their work was not physically exhausting, but it was monotonous and low-paid, full of fear of losing their respectable place. The upper middle class, industrialists and bankers, were the masters of this new world. They woke up in comfortable homes, but their mornings were devoted to business. Over breakfast, they might discuss stock prices or new contracts as they prepared to manage their industrial empires. Thus, the morning siren divided society into those who obeyed its call and those who created it or did not hear it at all. It was a sound that defined class affiliation louder than any title. But the main challenge was not the early rise, but the encounter with the soulless giants that awaited them in the workshops. In the next chapter, you will learn how machines dictated not only the rhythm of work, but also the rhythm of life itself. The center of any factory was the steam engine. It was a huge steam and fire-breathing creature of cast iron and steel that occupied a separate building. Its rhythmic, deafening breath, the puffing of pistons and hissing of steam, could be heard hundreds of meters away and set the pace for the entire production. The steam engine was the heart of the factory, and the hundreds of belt drives that radiated from it throughout the workshops were its arteries. These leather belts stretched across the ceiling, entangling the entire space and driving dozens, even hundreds of machines. The entire workshop lived and moved in a single rhythm set by the machine. When a worker entered the workshop, he found himself in a world of deafening, chaotic noise. The clanging and clanking of thousands of metal parts merged into a monotonous roar that did not stop for a second. After a few hours of work, this noise ceased to be perceived by the ears. It penetrated inside, causing constant tension. The weaving workshops were lined with rows of mechanical looms that wove endless lengths of fabric at incredible speed. The shuttles flew back and forth so fast that the eye could not follow them, creating an additional sharp clicking sound. The air was filled with cotton dust that settled on the lungs, hair, and clothing. The worker was not the master of the machine, but its appendage. His task was to maintain the mechanism, change the spools of thread, monitor their tension, and eliminate breaks. Any delay meant stopping the machine, and as a result, a fine sew movements had to be quick and precise. The machine knew no fatigue. It could work 24 hours a day, and it was its endurance that determined the length of the working day. People had to adapt to its rhythm, ignoring their own fatigue, hunger, and desire to rest. This mechanized world was alien and incomprehensible to the aristocracy. For them, the factory was just an abstract source of income, a line in the accounting book. They never went down to the workshops and had no idea of the cost of producing the fabrics from which their luxurious clothes were made. Even the factory owner, a representative of the upper middle class, rarely spent much time in the workshop. He sat in his quiet office, studying reports and signing papers. The noise and dust of production were for him only indicators of the successful work of his capital. For the worker, however, the machine was both his main partner and his main enemy. It gave him work and a means of subsistence, but in return it took away his strength and health. He spent more time with it than with his family. This daily battle between man and machine shaped a special character. Workers became silent and focused, their movements precise and mechanical. They learned to communicate with gestures because shouting in the noise was useless. The working day at the factory was an endless series of the same repetitive actions. The worker at the machine performed the same operation thousands of times per shift. Monotony was one of the most difficult tests for the human psyche. Time passed differently in the workshop. It was not divided into hours and minutes, but measured by the amount of product manufactured or the number of spools changed on the machine. The only landmarks were a short lunch break and the long-awaited final whistle. The worker's attention had to be constantly focused on the mechanism. A momentary lapse in vigilance could lead to a defect, which would be deducted from their salary or to the machine stopping. This constant control required enormous nervous tension. While the working class spent their days in this mechanical hell, the upper classes enjoyed a measured pace of life. An aristocrat's day was filled with a variety of activities aimed at pleasure. Morning walks, reading, playing bridge, visiting friends. All this was part of their routine. Work was considered indecent for an aristocrat. Their wealth was based on land ownership and was passed down by inheritance. They lived on rental income collected by their managers and considered any physical labor to be the lot of the lower classes. The middle class, on the contrary, valued work and considered it the basis of their respectability. However, their work was radically different from factory work. Doctors saw patients, lawyers studied cases, clerks copied papers. Their work required mental effort, not mechanical repetition. Even the poorest members of the middle class, such as teachers, had a certain degree of autonomy in their work. They could plan their day, take breaks, and interact with people. Factory workers did not have even a shadow of such freedom. At the same time, the situation of slaves in distant colonies could be hotly debated in Parliament. Lords and gentlemen made impassioned speeches about freedom and human dignity, completely ignoring the slavery that existed in the factories of their own country. For a worker, there was no such thing as career growth or self-fulfillment. He came to the factory young and strong and left it, if he lived to do so, worn out and sick. His only prospect was to keep his job as long as possible. Do you think such a system can be considered fair, even if it contributed to the economic growth of the entire country? In the next chapter, you will learn what those who created the empire's wealth and those who enjoyed it ate. The lunch break at the factory was short, usually no more than half an hour. Workers were not allowed to leave the premises. They ate right in the workshop, sitting on a box or directly on the floor next to their machine. The food was simple and brought from home in a lunch bag. Most often, it was a piece of bread, cheese, boiled potatoes, or an onion. There was practically no hot food, as there was nowhere and no time to heat it up. This modest meal took place in the same noisy and dusty atmosphere. There were no tables, no chairs, and no opportunity to eat in peace. Lunch was just a short break, necessary to gather strength and continue working until evening. At the same time, lunch was being served in London gentlemen's clubs or in the dining rooms of aristocratic mansions. It was a leisurely, hours-long ceremony with several courses. The tables were laden with soups, roast beef, game, puddings, and expensive wines. Members of the upper classes could sit at the table for hours, discussing the latest news or social gossip. For them, food was not just a source of energy, but a form of leisure and social interaction. They appreciated refined tastes and exquisite presentation of dishes. The contrast in nutrition was enormous. Workers consumed the minimum calories necessary to maintain physical performance. Their diet was monotonous and consisted mainly of carbohydrates, as meat was too expensive a luxury. The aristocrats' diet, on the other hand, was excessive. They consumed huge amounts of meat, fats, and sugar, which often led to health problems. Some dinners were so abundant that they required a long rest afterwards. Even among the middle class, lunch was an important part of the day. The family gathered around the table and ate hot food prepared by the lady of the house or the servants. This was a time for family interaction, which was not available to the working class, whose family members often worked different shifts. The poor or subclass who lived in slums often did not have a full lunch at all. Their existence depended on casual earnings or charity. Many of them ate scraps from markets or whatever they could find. Thus, food was another striking marker of class inequality. While some struggled for calories to survive, others gorged themselves on exquisite delicacies without even thinking about where they came from or who produced them. The factory workplace was a high-risk area. Dozens of moving mechanisms, rotating shafts, and flying shuttles operated without any protective barriers. Safety regulations were virtually non-existent. Factory owners were not interested in spending money on installing protective covers or improving working conditions. This was considered an unnecessary expense that reduced profits. Human resources were cheap and easily replaceable. Fatigue caused by long hours of monotonous work dulled alertness. Most accidents occurred at the end of the shift, when workers' concentration was at its lowest. Long clothing or hair could easily get caught in the machinery. At the same time, the aristocracy and gentry sought thrills in their entertainment, which also involved risk. Fox hunting, horse racing, duels, all of these could have serious consequences. However, this risk was a voluntary choice, a symbol of valor and status. For workers, risk was an integral part of their daily existence, which they could not refuse. They did not choose this danger, it was a condition of their employment. Their well-being depended not on courage, but on luck and speed of reaction. There was no concept of compensation for industrial injuries. If a worker was injured and could no longer perform his duties, he was simply dismissed. He was left without a livelihood, and his place was immediately taken by another. The concern for safety in high society manifested itself in a completely different way. It concerned the preservation of their property, protection from thieves, and ensuring the stability of their social status. The safety of their lives was ensured by an entire army of servants, doctors, and lawyers. The middle class sought a different kind of security, financial and social. They feared going bankrupt, losing their respectability, and sliding into the working class. This fear made them work hard and strictly adhere to moral standards. For the poor in the slums, the very concept of security was a luxury. Their lives were full of dangers of a different kind: hunger, disease, crime. They lived for the moment with no certainty about tomorrow. When the factory siren finally announced the end of the working day, an exhausted gray mass of people poured out of the gates. 14 hours of noise, dust, and tension left their mark on their faces and movements. The journey home was as joyless as the journey to work. In the evening, the streets were lit by dim gas lamps that only illuminated certain sections of the sidewalk. The workers trudged along familiar routes, often in silence. They had almost no energy left to talk. All they wanted was to get home and fall into bed. For many, the journey home was long and took about an hour. There was no public transport for workers, so they had to walk for miles in all weathers. Rain, snow, and biting wind were their constant companions. At the same time, for the upper classes, the evening was just beginning. Thousands of lights were lit in theaters, opera houses, and ballrooms. The aristocracy and wealthy bourgeoisie changed into their evening attire and went to social events. Their evenings were filled with music, dancing, exquisite dinners, and intellectual conversation. It was a world of glamour, luxury, and art, existing in parallel with a world of fatigue and poverty. They moved around the city in comfortable carriages, protected from the weather and street dirt. Even the leisure activities of the middle class were strikingly different. After work, a clerk or teacher could read a book by the light of a kerosene lamp, play board games with their family, or go to the pub for a pint of ale. They had personal time and energy to spend as they wished. After the journey home, a worker had only a few hours left for dinner and sleep. There was no question of leisure, reading, or self-improvement. Their whole life was reduced to a simple cycle: work, sleep, work. Women who worked alongside men had to do housework after the factory. Cooking, laundry, and cleaning awaited them. Their working day never really ended. The contrast in evening life was perhaps the most striking. While one part of the city fell asleep from exhaustion, the other part sparkled and reveled until late at night. These were two different poles of human existence. For the worker, home was not a place of rest, but only a short respite before the next day, which would be just like the one before. He fell asleep to the same distant hum of the factories that would wake him in the morning, and this cycle seemed endless. Working-class housing consisted of cramped, overcrowded apartments in tenement buildings built specifically for them. Often, an entire family of several generations would huddle together in one or two rooms. These houses were built as cheaply as possible, without regard for any sanitary standards. There was no running water or sewage system in such houses. Water was taken from a common tap in the courtyard, and the toilet facilities were located there as well. Due to overcrowding and lack of hygiene, epidemics constantly broke out in working-class neighborhoods. The rooms were dark and damp, as the houses were built very close to each other, blocking out the sunlight. The furniture was the simplest and most necessary: a bed, a table, and a few chairs. There was no question of comfort or personal space. At the same time, aristocratic mansions were veritable palaces: dozens of rooms, high ceilings, huge windows, expensive furniture, works of art on the walls. One such family occupied a space that could have housed hundreds of workers. Their homes were equipped with the latest technology of the time: hot water plumbing, bathrooms, and heating. A whole staff of servants maintained perfect order and cleanliness, taking care of their master's comfort. The middle class lived more modestly, but still in incomparably better conditions. Their homes were smaller but clean and tidy, with several rooms allowing for a living room, bedrooms, and a kitchen. They strove for respectability in everything, and their homes reflected this aspiration. For the worker, his home was not a fortress. It did not protect him from disease, cold, noise, or the dirt of the street. It was only a temporary refuge where he could spend a few hours before his next shift. In an atmosphere of lawlessness and inhuman working conditions, discontent gradually began to grow. At first, it was a quiet murmur, isolated conversations in workshops and pubs after work. Workers began to realize that their situation was not an inevitable fate, but the result of an unjust system. Any attempts to unite and assert their rights were brutally suppressed. The laws of the time were on the side of the factory owners. The formation of trade unions was prohibited, and any strike was equated with rebellion and punished by dismissal, arrest, or even exile. Despite the prohibitions, workers began to form secret societies and mutual aid funds. They collected small contributions to support the families of those who had lost their jobs or been injured. These were the first seeds of organized solidarity. Ideas about the need to fight for their rights were spread through leaflets and illegal newspapers. Literate workers read them aloud to their comrades. They learned about strikes at other factories, about demands to reduce the working day and increase wages. The leaders of these early movements were the most courageous and educated workers. They risked everything: their jobs, their freedom, and sometimes their lives. Their goal was to achieve basic human rights: an 8-hour workday, safe working conditions, and decent pay. For the upper classes, these movements were nothing more than a manifestation of laziness and ingratitude. They sincerely believed that they were doing workers a favor by giving them jobs. The idea of workers' rights seemed absurd and dangerous to them, threatening the foundations of society. The middle class viewed the labor movements with apprehension. On the one hand, they sympathized with the plight of the workers, but on the other, they feared unrest and revolution that could destroy the stability they had worked so hard to achieve. Factory owners saw trade unions as a direct threat to their profits and power. They used all means to fight them. They hired spies, created blacklists of activists, and provoked conflicts between workers. Nevertheless, the movement grew and strengthened. Strikes became increasingly widespread and organized. Workers learned to act together, put forward unified demands, and defend them despite pressure. It was a long and difficult struggle that lasted for decades, but it was in these smoky workshops and dark alleys of Victorian England that the modern labor movement was born. People who had been deprived of everything found the strength to fight not only for bread, but also for dignity. The Victorian era left behind a complex and contradictory legacy. It was a time of unprecedented technological breakthroughs, economic growth, and expansion of the British Empire. But the price of this progress was millions of lives spent in exhausting labor and poverty. The contrast between wealth and poverty reached its peak. The luxury and idleness of some was only possible thanks to the hard work of others. This gap was not only economic, but also cultural and ideological. A system built on such exploitation could not exist forever. The struggle of workers for their rights, which began in the form of secret societies, ultimately led to fundamental changes in society. Trade unions appeared, and labor laws were introduced to limit the length of the working day. The lessons of the Victorian era are still relevant today. They remind us that economic growth should not be achieved at the expense of human well-being. The concepts of social justice, workers' rights, and safe working conditions, which seem obvious to us today, were won through a hard struggle. Over time, society began to change. Social reformers and writers such as Charles Dickens drew attention to the appalling conditions of the poor. Fear of social upheaval forced the ruling classes to make concessions. Reforms in healthcare and education began. Sanitary conditions in cities gradually improved. Society slowly, with difficulty, but moved towards greater humanity. However, the class inequality so characteristic of that era did not disappear completely. It transformed, took on new forms, but continues to exist in the modern world. The question of the fair distribution of wealth remains one of the most pressing. We have gone through a day in the life of a Victorian worker, seeing the world through his eyes. A world full of smoke, noise, and hard labor. We saw the striking contrast between his reality and the glamorous life of the upper classes, who seemed to exist in another universe. This era left us not only with great inventions, but also with important social issues that we are still dealing with today. What do you think is the most influential legacy of the Victorian era on our modern lives? Perhaps it is labor legislation, class stratification, or the very concept of industrial production? We would love to see your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you want to continue exploring the unknown corners of history and learn about how people lived in different eras, subscribe to our channel. There are many more interesting and informative stories ahead.